Hi, everybody, and welcome. We're going to get started in just a minute. We should have had some theme music for you, Brandy. What you got, girl?
That would have been nice, but I don't know what my theme song is, so I'm scared to have you pick it.
We'll, we'll work
know.
on it for NASPA. We'll work on it for
All right.
NASPA. That's what we'll do when
Okay.
we get to Chicago.
Okay.
All right, you guys, we want to make sure we honor you and honor your time. So we want to go ahead and get started. This session is being recorded, so you will be able to view it later. All right, so thank you for taking your time to participate in this first teach-in of ASPA section on democracy and social justice. I'm Dr. Vanessa Lopez Littleton, an associate professor and chair in the Department of Health, Human Services and Public Policy at California State University, Monterey Bay. I also serve as the chair of ASPA section on democracy and social justice, and I'm honored to moderate today's event. Before we begin, I'd like to send a big thank you to my colleagues at ASPA for sharing this information broadly and for consistently keeping equity on the top of mind of our ASPA agenda. I'd also like to say thank you to my colleagues, Jose Irizarry, Jordan Davis, Nicole Diggs, and James Norton, who are also officers on our SDSJ board. So for those of you who are uncertain about what a teach-in is, I wanted to provide just a little bit of context about why we're using this format, and then what made us choose a teach-in over some of the other options that are available to us for these types of events. And so a teach-in is basically a tool that's been used for social protest, and it's a way to advance social change. We've been doing this for decades now. The concept started back in the 1960s on college campuses where students and faculty were not able to actively engage in social protests because of various restrictions. And so teach-ins became a way of social protest to engage the community in understanding different perspectives that were being shared with them either through mainstream media, other mechanisms. I always hesitate to say propaganda because it always sounds so sinister, right? So we chose this format because we want to use these sessions as a teaching tool so that we can share these broadly with those who may not readily or easily gravitate towards the work that we're doing in advancing social equity. So for us, we don't merely want to preach to the choir, but we want to be able to look more holistically and inclusively at our approach to doing this work. So advancing equity will require not just those of us who have, identified ourselves as social equity champions, but we need everyone, and particularly those with power, influence, and authority to be involved in this work. And so that we're able to center on Dr. Blessed's work today, we've disabled the chat function. My colleague who's working behind the scenes, Jose, he's going to drop a link in the chat. So if you have questions for our guest today, please feel free to just drop your quick questions into that Google form. We'll take a look at it and get those queued up for you. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce today's featured speaker, Dr. Blandy Blessed. So Dr. Blessed is an associate professor in the leadership and management area in the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Blessed has developed a reputation as a socially conscious researcher, administrator, teacher, and community partner. Her personal ethic has always been to center the lived experience to offer more robust insights by those directly impacted by administrative decisions. So I want to say period kind of at the end of that, because that's so powerful. And so of all the accolades that she's amassed, it is my pleasure to welcome to the virtual stage my dear friend, Brandy.
Thank you, Vanessa. Dr. Lopez Littleton, excuse me. I really am excited to be here. I see a lot of names and faces here that are familiar. I see other folks that I don't know, but hope to get to know and engage in this process. And I'm really excited to have this conversation. So thank you to the entire DSJ board for facilitating such important work, not only this year, but in previous years. I will say that as a member of ASPA, DSJ has always come to the forefront and been responsive in times of need and addressing the most pressing issues as it relates to current affairs. And so this is, or current events. And so this is really on par with that conversation. So my plan is to spend about 20 minutes or so and engage you all with the PowerPoint, and then really want to have a conversation with Dr. Lopez Littleton to open this up. Jose has already put in the chat a Google form that will allow you to ask questions. And so they will kind of field those questions as they come in, but hopefully this can be a conversation that we can engage in. And so I'm going to share my screen. And I hope that you can see that. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Blue, I saw your thumb. All right, so as was mentioned, we're talking equity versus equality today in the teach-in. On a personal note, today is of particular significance for me. One, because my mom retired today after 23 years in Detroit, and I just want to say congratulations to her. Today would have been my grandfather's 95th birthday. Today is my father-in-law's birthday, and I also have a cousin who's sharing a birthday today. So it's a lot of milestones happening, and for me to be able to engage in this conversation with you all is really important. And so thank you again for taking some time to spend an hour with us. So I'm going to start off by talking about how language and narratives are important. Gutierrez says that sensitivity to language is responsibility to language, and respect for its power to call forth whatever is summoned by its use. In a nutshell, your words matter. I am a fan of Bell Hooks, and I often think about how she talks about the importance of naming the systems that oppress us. The importance of, because if you name it, then you have more of an ability to, solve the problem, to really get at the crux of an issue. And so she would often use a phrase, imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, right? When you see all those words together, you might feel taken aback. There could be a visceral response physically to how you understand these words or the imagery that may be conjured up. You may even feel defensive when we use these terms. But I think that visceral response is explicitly why naming oppression is important. When you think about this language, or you think about the phrasing that she uses, what type of reflection can and should we be having? How do we understand the ways in which words impact us? How do they make us feel? And how do our words make other people feel? Taken in this vein, I think it's also important when we are engaging with our stakeholders, or with our class, or our students, or with the citizenry at large. Learning a person's name is really important because it makes them feel seen, right? Using the correct pronouns makes people feel respected. Valuing what a person says about their lived experience, regardless of their background, identity, or status in life, really creates and opens up a space for conversation and context. And so through our words, we shape the meaning of how we engage and relate to one another. Hopefully those engagements are rewarding and inviting, but we also need to recognize that sometimes those words or our language can be off-putting. So we need to be aware that our words indeed matter. I think often about DEI, right? DEI is everywhere and nowhere at the exact same time. It's interesting how leaders, institutions have co-opted this language, particularly as it relates to the racial and social justice movements in a post 2020 summer, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. I've said this before, but in the summer, in the immediate aftermath of 2020, I heard more organizations use the word racism and white supremacy than I had ever heard before in faculty meetings and in professional associations. However, once the interest waned, we went back to business as usual. And so when we walk the walk and talk the talk about DEI, it's not just the pretty websites and pamphlets and flyers that demonstrate and show diversity. It's what are the actions behind that imagery and that superficial nature that really moves us in the direction to honor what these letters collectively mean. When we think about DEI, diversity is really the easiest part of this acronym that organizations can really get into, right? Diversity means the condition of having or being composed of different elements. In other words, it's having people of different races and ethnicities and ideologies and physical abilities and political beliefs really engaged in a conversation or in community with one another. You can see from the image on the right that diversity is really just having those people in the room, which is very different than inclusion, right? When we think about diversity in this context and how it's often applied, we can count physically the number of different types of people we have in a space, but that doesn't mean that we honor and recognize what they bring to the table. And so although we may hold celebrations or programs, we have Black History Month and Women's History Month and Latinx Month, and we celebrate Cinco de Mayo. We do all of those things, but none of that. And it's great to recognize the contributions that people have had and different communities have had to this country. But unless we're transforming the systems and the institutional structures that have created and maintained and produced racialized inequality in this country, diversity as you see it in this image is performative. What I want us to think about is how do we move from the easiest step in the D to get to the E and the I. Inclusion, on the other hand, is the culture of belonging by actively engaging by actively inviting the contribution and participation of all people. It's understanding that everyone's voice adds value and strives to create balance in the face of power differences. Look at the diversity image on the left and look at the inclusion image on the right. How does all of that diversity fit together to create an organizational environment that allow people to show up as their true self, that allow their voices to be heard and for them to be seen as decision makers? Proclaiming we value DEI, but not working to create inclusive environments and spaces where people can bring their full and authentic selves into the workspace is a really disingenuous sentiment. And I found time and time again that we aren't there yet. We can proclaim DEI, but our institutions do not reflect the DEI for which they want to lift up. I'm sure you all have seen various iterations of this image. Equality, the state of being equal, especially in status, rights, and opportunities. However, only working to achieve equality ignores historical and structural factors that benefit some groups and disadvantage other groups. I think this imagery by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation really gets at the heart of why the teach-in is so important, particularly around the use of language for equity and equality. I think people often use these words interchangeably, thinking that they mean the same, but you can see through these visual representations that they're very, very different. Equity, on the other hand, is the quality of being fair and impartial, the ability to provide different levels of support based on an individual or group's needs in order to achieve fairness in outcomes. Equality gave everybody the same bike, regardless of their ability to use that bike. And you can see in that first image how folks are struggling to engage in the activity in a way that honors their full self. Equity, on the other hand, gave folks the bike that they needed, right? The kid got a smaller bike. The person in the back got a tricycle, right? It allows people to show up and really participate in the activity, in the conversation, in a way that we often take for granted. I start with these definitions, and I have a few more, but it's really important that we are all on the same page. If we're talking about equity and justice initiatives, it's important that we know what we're talking about. And so I think I want to just make sure that we're continuing to anchor our conversations using similar language. Last two definitions, I promise. So racial equity, when race is no longer a predictor of outcomes, which lead to more just outcomes, policies, practices, attitudes, and cultural messages. So when I think about racial equity, I think about the work of Dr. Lopez Littleton, who has done significant research on maternal health outcomes for Black women in Louisiana. So her research illuminates the fact that to be a Black woman, to be a Black birthing person, right? The likelihood that she may die during her pregnancy is greater than her white counterparts. That is a racial, and that in and of itself is racial inequity, because race is an indicator of what that outcome is. I think about her work on Black infant mortality. Black babies are more likely to die before their first birthday than their white counterparts. If race was no longer an issue, we wouldn't be having a conversation about Black infant maternal or mortality, right? When I think about mass incarceration, we all conjure up imagery around the disproportionate impacts for which Black and brown people are likely to engage with the criminal legal system. The stats are true and they remain the same. 1 in 3 Black men are likely to have some engagement with the criminal legal system in their lifetime. If that's not racial inequity, I don't know what is. We're talking about a systematic way in which race has dictated and determined the outcome, the quality of life or outcome for how Black men are navigating society. The last definition I'd like to share with you is social equity. The fair, just, and equitable management of all institutions serving the public directly or by contract. The fair and just, equitable distribution of public services and implementation of public policy, and the commitment to promote fairness, justice, and equity in the formation of public policy. And so this definition has been adopted by the National Academy of Public Administration. And this definition is the definition used by the Standing Panel on Social Equity amongst the NAPA Fellows. It's guiding the work for which this group of folks are engaged in. And so when we think about equity, it's easy for people to talk about, well, I don't know what to do with it, or how do you achieve it? Or how do you know, how do you measure it, right? And because it has been so ambiguous in our literature in some ways, as it relates to metrics, people often, it's easier to cast it aside or to do it later. I want to lift up the work of Savara and Brunette, who actually in 2004 came up with this framework or these dimensions of social equity. So they recognize social equity and it has 4 dimensions. They talk about procedural fairness. And the associated outcome of that is it ensures equal protection and due process in personnel actions and business and operational dealings, right? Due process. Access. ensures that appropriate allocations of resources are made so that fair results are realized by all stakeholders. Quality ensures consistent quality of services to all stakeholders. And ultimately equitable outcomes, which ensures the absence of disparities in processes, equal access, and procedural activities, right? And so while I don't have the privilege to actually go through all of this because we only have an hour, I do want to lift up the first two dimensions and really think through a problem and how this has in ways for which we can think about a solution, or ways for which solutions have evolved. So this is work that I've done some years ago about disenfranchisement strategies that were used by local governments. I wanted to lift this up because we are in the process or approaching midterm elections, which has significant impacts for large proportions of our constituents and residents in this country. Every year, lawmakers leverage their creativity to limit access to the ballots to constituents. And so I started this project and I created this table. And this table in and of itself has strategies and tools that go back to the 1900s, right? What you see here in bold are the strategies that are currently being used by state and local officials to continue to marginalize Black and Brown communities from accessing their right to the ballot. So across the top refers to the categories of disenfranchisement. So things that create financial hardship. You think about the poll tax, you think about voter ID. Things that create confusion. We've seen and heard about, folks purging voters from the rolls, or inaccurate or not necessarily sharing the most appropriate or up-to-date rules with eligible voters. Restricting English language services to people who speak, who doesn't speak English as a first or primary language. I think about the impact of felony disenfranchisement, right? Again, I mentioned to you earlier that Black and Brown people are most likely having the most contact in the criminal legal system, and as a result, are most likely to be impacted by felony disenfranchisement. Thinking about ways to limit access to the ballot. I'm going to talk about Georgia as a solution in just a moment, but Governor Kemp really implemented many of these strategies today or in the last election. He decreased the number of early voting days, closed the polls, used violence and intimidation, right? Or used intimidation, maybe not the violence part. We think about the ways for which our vote continues to be diluted geographically, right? Either through gerrymandering or reapportionment. Think about the fact that in some communities, folks who have been incarcerated, when they go into those rural communities and are housed there to serve their sentences, that population gets counted as a part of the reapportionment for state and local elections, right? So rural communities are able to take advantage of the prison population while simultaneously diluting the quantity or concentration of voters in urban spaces. And also thinking about subjective measures of eligibility, provisional ballots, and all of these vouchers of good character, right? These are things that are happening in real time to continue to disenfranchise people. What can we do about it? I think about Fair Fight. It's leading the charge to protect voting rights in the state of Georgia. This is Stacey Abrams. This is the brainchild of Stacey Abrams. And democracy works best when we put in place guardrails that ensure every American has an equal opportunity to make their voice heard and to be fairly represented. And this is directly from their website. How are they doing that? They have a three-pronged approach. They are addressing the systematic issues from a litigation standpoint, which seeks to fortify the rights to vote and ban discrimination in voting, despite the fact that these are constitutional amendments, right? You can't discriminate But states, again, have been very creative in how they minimize access to the ballot. I think about legislation. So to what extent are they able, moving forward, to create laws to ensure accountability and to eliminate the mismanagement that has occurred in state elections? And I think about advocacy, the role for which officials are playing to better educate citizens about elections and their voting rights and how to be engaged. When we think about all of these things, the litigation, the legislation, and the advocacy piece, this is what we mean when we talk about social equity from a procedural justice or procedural fairness perspective, okay? I'm often reminded of the water crises in urban communities. These are pictures taken directly from news articles in Jackson, Mississippi, Baltimore, Maryland, and Flint, Michigan. I'm sorry, the sun it keeps moving. I've been running away from it all day. So what do these three cities have in common? Primarily low-income Black cities. They've long suffered from disinvestment and a crumbling infrastructure. This water crisis is a collateral consequence of a political and economic system that sees the people in these communities and the communities themselves as expendable. And let's be honest, this would never happen in Madison, Mississippi, in Grosse Pointe Farms, Michigan, or Bel Air, Maryland, the richest cities in these respective areas. When we're talking about access, or when we're talking about quality, it requires us to think about a process that is fair and impartial to all stakeholders. This is a model from the Government Alliance on Racial Equity. It fortifies us to think about how decisions can be made with intention and with purpose, not from the political whims of actors, but through a more strategic process to think about policy, how they're developed, and how resources are allocated. You'll see the six-part strategic plan here on the left-hand side, and they talk about normalizing using a racial equity framework. And this in and of itself really speaks to the fact that, like, oftentimes we think about racial equity as something that we need to go at it alone, or there are no existing toolkits or resources out there. I'd like to tell you that there are a ton of resources out there, okay? So the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, the City of Seattle, and the City of Portland actually have a number of different racial toolkits that can be used and modified for your local or your respective jurisdictions. Even the state of Virginia has launched a DEI plan to institutionalize equity across state governments. And so this isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. There will need to be modifications to these tools, but you're not starting from scratch. And there's no reason for you to only think that it doesn't exist for my location, for my organization. There's no need for me to operate, or no need for me to engage. The next thing is to operate with urgency and accountability. The reality is the impact of discrimination and injustice requires immediate action. The residents of Flint, Jackson, and Baltimore are literally waiting on a whim. And in some cases, these are life or death situations that require public officials and public administrators to act responsibly. So to justify an action because it's not the right time is really contributing or being complicit to the status quo. When we think about organizing, it's important for us to think about how do we build organizational capacity inside and outside? How do we partner with other organizations within the community? Where are your allies, okay? And I think, again, too often, it's only a few of us that we feel like we have to go at it alone. If there are people in your respective organizations that can push this work forward, then are there people outside of the organization who could help support you? Are there people outside of the organization who could serve as your brain trust or your community of practice to help you think strategically about how to move this work forward? When we think about it really requires us to have a plan to address inequity. And then we need to operationalize it, right? We need to use data to drive our action. Is there enough data? And trust me, there's enough data to talk about quality of life outcomes for people in urban communities, for Black people, for Latino people, for LGBTQ people. There's enough data out there. So that's not the issue. The issue is, how are we using that data to inform better policies and practices? Measurement can take place at two levels. The first is to measure the specific programmatic and policy changes that are needed. And second, to develop baselines, to set goals and measure progress, right? So when we're talking about the fact that we want to understand what the need is, where do we start? What's the intervention? Where do we end? And this is an iterative process. So just because you create a plan and you go through it one time, you have not, this is not the work. The work is for us to be committed to this until we have no disparities at all, okay? And so this image here that you see to the right is a reflection of kind of like the process of working from, starting from the end and working backwards. It's a results-based accountability model that asks 7 key questions. What are your desired results? What should the results look like? What are the community indicators that would measure that result? What do the data tell us? Who are our partners? What works to change the data trends toward racial equity? And what action should you start with? This requires, again, an all hands-on approach. It requires for you to plan. So anybody talking that we're just gonna, so let me back up. If we're doing equity work, it has to be at the start of the process. Oftentimes, folks do strategic plans and then like, oh, we forgot about equity, let's drop it in somewhere. No, equity needs it to be at the forefront of the work that you're doing in an organization, in an academic program, in your engagement. It should inform the way you see the process, the ways for which you engage with your constituents. And so more than anything, and I want to make sure we have enough time, I want to open this up for questions, but I want to leave us with this. I can talk equity until we're all blue in the face, and we don't want to do that. I will say that this is hard work. We often take for granted the embeddedness of how these we often take for granted the embeddedness of how these processes inform us. It's often just so unconscious that we've always done things this way, so we will continue to do things this way. As a result, that informs our attitudes, our behaviors, and how we think about people and communities. And so I'm happy to have you all here to engage in a conversation for an hour. The real question is, what are you going to do when you leave this space? How are you going to be better advocates for the communities for which you serve? How are you going to engage them and partner with them so that you all can co-create solutions together? To what extent are we willing to push our respective organizations to think more intently, to be more purposeful, to develop policies that put equity at the forefront? Our budget reflects our priorities. And so if we are talking, oh, we care about equity, but we don't have the budget for that, then you don't care about equity, right? I want us to be honest in our approach. And I also want us to be committed to that. It starts with the commitment. This plan, this work starts with a commitment. A plan, resources, and the fortitude to continue when it's not popular, when it gets hard, when you are tired. It's wonderful to see so many people engaged in this conversation, because when you get tired, then somebody else, you can sit on the bench and take a rest for somebody else to step into the game, right? I need all of us to recognize that this work isn't the work of diversity, of diverse people, right? We need white allies engaged in this work. All the Black people, Latinx people, Indigenous people could be engaged and do this work if they, all we wanted. We still need assistance from white allies and people with resources to help contribute and move the needle. You are not alone, so lean into your community, leverage your brain trust, and let's work together to create the world we want. This will not happen with just hopes and prayers and one-off trainings. We have to be in this for the long haul. And I really, really look forward to being a part of the community for which you all are engaged in to help advance this work forward. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open this conversation up to Dr. Lopez Littleton, if I could find my mouse. There we go. Sorry.
Yay. Thank you so much, Dr. Blessed. What an honor to spend time listening and reflecting and thinking about the things that you have to say. So I do have a couple of questions, and so I'm going to go back for a minute to the beginning of your talk, where you started in thinking about the words. And so you started with a very powerful quote, and you centered the importance of words. And so we know that our language is shaped by our worldviews, our knowledge, our bias, and even our ability to reflect on our power, our privilege, and our station in life. And so, in your opinion, what is the role and importance of self-reflection and personal responsibility in advancing equity?
I think that's the key, right? I think a lot of times we have, let me just say that when we're doing this work, and I think I mentioned that, we started with language, or we started with definitions, and there may have been a visceral response to Bell Hooks's phrasing, imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. If you felt a way about that string of words together, ask yourself why, right? That self-reflection piece is so important, but it's the self that you need to think about. It's the self that when you look in the mirror, you need to begin to ask yourself, what is it about this moment, this string of words, this content, this group of people, this community that makes me feel away? And you need to be honest about what that is. I think the best part about that is it's a conversation that you have with yourself. You don't need to expose yourself. You don't need to shout it out in a meeting. You don't need to tell your partner if you don't want to, but you need to be honest and have the conversation with yourself if you're ever going to get to a space where that doesn't impact the way you do your job, right? And so I think self-reflection is key. I mean, you and I've been doing this work for a long time, and I still have to reflect, because as I get new information that I may not agree with, I need to figure out, like, what is it? Why am I tripping? Why do I feel some kind of way about this issue, about this person, about this engagement? But self-reflection, like, we have to be introspective about this work, because our personal informs our professional. And if folks don't recognize that, then I think that they're lying to themselves.
So I think it's hard, right? Because particularly when it comes to conversations about race, we still live in very segregated communities, a lot of us, like even people who live in what we'll call racially diverse communities, or there's a lot of different ethnicities within the communities. The reality is a lot of us still don't spend time in community with one another, really understanding diverse cultures and having these types of critical conversations. And so even when we were putting this one together, right, one of my colleagues just kind of made a remark, well, we've got 2 Black women, starting our first conversation. Like, where's the diversity in that? Like, I mean, the person didn't say all that, but that's how I processed it, right? And I'm thinking to myself, who better to start a conversation than people who have lived through the oppression, who have to show up in rooms and in spaces constantly to have to, address people who push back against our Blackness or our femininity, or it could be something else about our social identities that makes them uncomfortable with us even being in these particular meetings and formats. And so one of the things that I'm constantly thinking about is when we are doing this DEI work, where we have colleagues who say, well, when it comes to increasing the diversity of faculty, we've done everything that we could to diversify the pool. We're just not able to hire any diverse people. So, how do you respond to that? Like, in this context, is it enough to just diversify pools to, I'll do these air quotes and say, try to do the work of actually advancing equity, creating a plan, but nowhere in your plan do you actually call out racism or other systems of oppression? and so the question becomes, how do you even know if you're successful if you don't have the wherewithal to even name the problem? So I'm going to stop there because I want to really get into some of this notion of performative wokeness, because a part of that's embedded within here too. But your response, Randy.
So the first thing you said is like, why two Black women, right? Like that already assumes that Black people are a monolith and that you and I are going to be the same, right? Period. And I think that is not true, right? And we always want to lump all Black people together, right? And so you and I care about equity issues, but you and I have had our own debates and discussions about many of these things that we don't agree on, right? And look, we're Black and we got locks, you know what I'm saying? Like that's not the thing that is going to drive or dictate issues, right? I think the conversation, particularly around the recruitment of or creating diverse pools, is like, it's all about where you, if you want to create a diverse pool of candidates for a position, then go to spaces where those people exist. Don't say that, I'm going to go to all of the same places and advertise positions in all of the same places, only to be sad that you don't have a diverse candidate pool, right? I mentioned in the beginning that all of this stuff takes work, right? It's going to take extra effort for you to identify quality candidates. If Beyonce can find a whole Black band for Coachella, and Black folks to play instruments, all these different types of instruments, don't tell me that we don't have Black people that do all these different types of things, right? Like the conversation is always that we don't have the talent, that we don't know where to look, we don't know where these things are. The reality is we haven't done our due diligence to actually seek out those opportunities, seek out those folks. And to a certain extent, I feel like, is it the chicken or the egg, right? You may want to invite diverse candidates into a space, but if they look on your website and don't see themselves reflected, or they don't see an environment for which they will be welcomed, that's going to be a non-starter for a lot of people anyway, right? And so, we can attract Black people and Black faculty into spaces, but can we keep them? And part of the reason is no, because these institutions don't really foster an environment that is inclusive, that is equitable, and that recognizes all of the other emotional labor that goes along with being Black faculty in the academy, right? I think about the fact that, most of the time, it's only one of us in the school or the department, right? I've been the only one in several spaces. And so Black students see me and they're like, hey, I like you because you look like me. And I want to tell you all of my problems and you're my advisor, even if you aren't my advisor. That doesn't get recognized. I do community engaged work. That isn't a part of the tenure requirements, right? Like it takes me twice as long to publish articles because of the type of work that I do. I'm not just spitting out statistical analysis. I'm not hating on you folks who do stats, but my point is that there are all these ways for which we can contribute to community. But if we are bound by the same and these normative rules and structures, then we continue to reproduce institutions and spaces that are not inviting to Black folks or Black faculty and Black students.
Yeah, so thank you so much for that. I was all over the place with that quasi question and narrative that I gave. So I'm going to pull a question that someone posted in the on the Google form, and it says, "The weight of this work is crushing. Where do you get support? I am fighting with an entire HR and state to do equity work. It is not for the weak." So do you want to respond to that? There's no real question in there. It's just really about like, where do you get support to continue to do this work?
I got my brain trust, right? I have senior people who have, been sounding boards for me when I am in a crunch or need advice. I have peer colleagues who I just go to and vent. I have created community for myself. Like PA is way more diverse than it used to be, But I think about 11 years ago, I could go to some of these conferences and really count on one hand how many people of color, how many Black people that I saw, right? And when you saw each other, you were like, hey, let's hang out, let's be friends, like let's navigate this conference together, right? That's the part that I think you have to find your people. Your people may not be in your organization, but your people understand what you're going through. They will allow you to vent. They will strategize with you. You can't take on it. You can't beat that system on as one individual going up against a state agency, right? Or that's not doable. But what can you do within your sphere of influence? What can you do within the direct responsibilities that you have? I think that's your work. I think because the issues that we're facing are so complex, they're so big, it can seem like we're never making progress. But the reality is we don't have to do everything. We just need to do our thing, and we need to do our thing well, right? And as you continue to do your thing well, people will see that. They will want to join in. They will want to support you, or they will just have your back, right? And I think we have to be okay with that. These systems, we have been put in spaces where we think we have to be the one to dismantle the thing. This thing has been ongoing for 400 years. That's not my job, right? People have done this work and died doing this work, and it's still here. That's not your job, right? Do what you can do it well, find your people, but take care of yourself at the end of the day, right? Because if you die, they're gonna step over your body and find somebody to replace you to do the work, right? Like it's gonna be there. So do what you can, but take care of yourself in the process.
Yeah, I love that. So there's a couple of questions in here about data. Like, one of the parts of your talk, you talked a lot about like using data. And so how do you, think about the notion of interpreting and analyzing data? And when we get that data, particularly in public agencies, it's like, how is that data used? How do we work with state and local governments to really use the data to make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, data is what you make it. I think in a lot of ways, we don't have good data. Like we don't have good data as it relates to like aggregate racial ethnic data, right? And I mean, I'm gonna go out on a limb and just say that I don't think I think that's intentional, right? Because if you don't have the data to measure the thing, then you can't really fix or address the thing, right? And so I think that we do have data. I think that we need people who value equity to begin to try to understand, the quality of that data and use that data to inform policy. The data piece is hard because there's so much information that we could be collecting that would be useful to us that we just don't have, right? As an example, I think about police involved killings. There's no federal database on that, right? It's not. In the aftermath of Trayvon Martin, there was kind of an ongoing list from the Washington Post where they kind of kept track of these numbers. But that was it, and it was disabled, after a few years. But like, what does that say to you that there's no federal or state requirement to track police involved killings, right? That data is important and it tells us a lot, but the fact that it doesn't exist also tells us a lot, right? And so I think it's important for us to look at quality data sources where you have them, right? I think about the census. I think about Department of Labor. I think about some of these spaces that may offer you some quality data. But in some ways, you're going to have to try to start collecting data maybe at the organizational level that really reflects what you're trying, the disparity that you're trying to address. I'm sorry, that was kind of all over the place, but the data piece is so interesting because a lot of the data that we want or need just doesn't exist. And I don't think that's by accident.
Yeah, and I think data is power. And I think sometimes people hoard data or even like use it to shape the narrative that they want to, put out there in front of people. So sometimes it's like, even when people have large data sets and then they, publish on a piece of it, it's like, can I have access to the full data set so that I can take a look at it and disaggregate it and take a look? So sometimes if that can happen, then I think that that helps to shed a light on some of these kind of nuances that we deal with in the work that we do.
I think so. Federal grants, though, for the most part, at least the grant that I got through DOJ required that we submit our data, right? And that after a certain amount of time, it was made publicly available. And so, if you're interested, if you receive a federal grant, I'm almost certain that might be true with NIH and NIA. There may be repositories of data or from projects that have been done that may offer quality data that you can disaggregate in your own way. But if we think about what's being collected at state and local levels, it really is hit or miss.
Okay, my cat showed up, so if you jump on me and I have to turn my camera off, my apologies. So I have two more questions I want to make sure we get to. The first is, does equity require that some group give up something? We hear this all the time, and so I'd like you to respond to that, but then also thinking about, why should they? And how do we overcome the thought that advancing equity will inevitably hurt some people or some groups of people?
I don't know that people lose. I think the people who are starting further behind, I think they get more, right? If you're in a space of privilege and you're concerned that somebody else getting more than you is taking something out of your mouth, right? Or out of your pocket, we're having the wrong question. That's the wrong question to be asked. And you see that now with the student loan forgiveness. Oh, I paid my loans off. Everybody should have to pay their loans off. Why? Because you had why is that the conversation around student loan forgiveness? You know what I mean? I don't know, that's hard because I think that's a value proposition. And I think that people who are arguing around, I had to suffer, you should suffer too. I don't know what the starting ground is to engage in conversation with them, because clearly we're not starting from the same values perspective, right? We're not starting from the same space. And so, I'm not of the mindset that I want to argue with people who can't recognize my humanity, who can't recognize kind of what some of these just fundamental issues are. I'm not trying to change your mind. If you feel the way you do, then so be it. I just am not in a space where I want to use my energy trying to convince somebody about a thing that we just fundamentally disagree on the principle. That's probably not the best answer, but there's too much work to be done for me to be trying to convince you that these are important issues.
Yeah, no, what I appreciate about your response is a lot of the stress and strain of doing this work and struggle, like some of the other people also had those same questions about how do you, keep doing the work? How do you keep pushing? That's how you have to have these boundaries. And I see that in you frequently, is that, there are some things that you're not going to digress to. It's like, how do you move people up instead of how do you go down to really get into the dirt with them to figure out, why are we even doing this work, right? We're doing this work because these disparities exist. And for African Americans in the United States, people are dying.
Mhm.
And so I had a hard conversation with folks yesterday in Appalachia State. And at the end of the conversation, I was asked a question about, how do we get more white people to apply for jobs in a predominantly Black community? And so I'm sitting there thinking to myself, what does this have to do with the lives that are being lost? And so sometimes I think that people, this is difficult work, but we have to stay focused. And so I'll pose this to you, Brandy. A lot of the times that you're talking, you're centering Blackness, right? And Black people and Black issues. And so do you ever get pushback from people who say, well, what about Latinx people? Well, what about LGBTQ? What about? And so how do you talk about that in these intersecting identities?
I mean, we're all intersectional people, right? We all hold multiple identities, right? For me, right? You're right. The work that I do, I focus on Black people. There are lots of other people out there who, if they want to focus on white people, they can. If they want to focus on people with disabilities, they can. If they want to focus on LGBTQ people, they can, right? I'm not knocking your hustle, but this is my thing, right? This is where I'm at, and these are the things that I care about. So I say all that to say, as somebody, I check a lot of those intersectional boxes, right? But these are the issues that drive my passion. These are the things that I care about. And that's why I'm focused on those issues, right? Oftentimes we want to have a comparative group, or we want to be inclusive of all people. Sometimes the conversation requires us to focus on one group at a time. And the group that I'm really interested in, and don't get me wrong, my conversation or focus and intentionality on Black people and Black communities is not to say I don't care about those other people, right? But if we lift the tide for Black people and those who are most vulnerable, everybody wins, right? And so I'm not in a space where I'm trying to argue with folks about, well, why don't you do this? Well, if you're that concerned, then you be the one to do it, right? Like, but everybody has their lane, and this is my lane. And again, I value and am working on behalf of equity for all people, right? Like, but when I think about where my passion lies, it is for Black people and the experiences that they've had trying to navigate this country.
Okay, perfect. A rising tide raise all boats. All right, so one last question before we wrap up. You got 1 minute, Randy. What can people do in the field to foster social equity like human service nonprofits? Maybe 2 minutes.
Read the question again.
What can people do? Where did it go? Hold on. What can people do in the field to foster social equity like human service nonprofits? I guess just thinking about nonprofit organizations, what can they begin to do to foster social equity?
I think that they can diversify their boards. I think that they can listen to the lived experience of their clientele. I think that they can revisit the institutional policies. And so while we're talking, the question was focused on nonprofits, I think this applies to all organizations, right? Have you done an equity audit? Have you really assessed your internal policies and programs and processes to determine where inequity lies, right? Are you willing to do that work? Are you willing to not do the one training, but create a conversation and a culture of learning in your respective organization where people aren't just checking off the box but they are invested and engaged in creating a culture and environment that's responsive and engaging with the community being served, right? To what extent are the people or the clienteles of a particular organization involved in decision-making? Are they a part of the grant making process? Are they in positions where they can help allocate resources or think through policy? Are they on the board of directors, right? That representation matters. And so I think that like examining the internal aspects of the organization is one of the first things that we can do. What are our hiring practices? What are we signaling on our website about what we value and who we value? What does our mission statement say? And is there mission drift between what we claim we're doing and versus what we're actually doing, right? And I think we have to be willing to put in the resources, build an infrastructure, and continue to put in the resources that will allow us. This is an iterative process. So very much like strategic planning, we do this every 5 years. You shouldn't do the thing and then put it on the shelf and then think about it after 5 years, right? Like we should be looking at this every year to see what changes need to be made. It should be a living document. And when we're assessing our policies and our practices, we should be doing that on a pretty regular basis. And I think that puts us in the right direction. But nonprofits, we should be working to put ourselves out of business, right? And if not, then we in the wrong game. We not doing it the right way.
I just said that yesterday. We are such alike, but different. All right. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time to launch our teach-in series. Over the next year, we plan to have more of these sessions. My colleague, Jose Irizarry, has posted a short questionnaire in the chat. Please take 1 to 2 minutes to complete that. That will help us to improve our processes and the decisions that we make in what type of teach-ins we offer in the future. Another shout out to ASPA and also our section on democracy and social justice. There is the information on our Twitter and our website posted in the chat. These slides will be available for viewing on our YouTube channel. We'll link them on Twitter, and we'll also share those out with all the participants who registered for today's event. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you for participating. Thanks, Brandy.
Thanks, everybody. I hope you all have a beautiful day.
All right, take care.
Bye.